One of the most common questions in storytelling is deceptively simple. Where do stories come from? At first glance, the answer appears obvious. Stories seem to begin with ideas. A writer imagines a situation, a character, a conflict, or a setting, and the story grows from there. In practice, however, the process is rarely that simple. This variety can be confusing for beginning writers. One source may argue that character desire is the foundation of all storytelling. Another may claim that theme comes first. A third may insist that conflict is a true starting point. Faced with these competing viewpoints, writers often wonder which method is correct. The answer is that stories can emerge from many different starting points. Different writers think differently, different genres emphasize different elements. Different stories present different creative challenges. A mystery writer may begin with a solution to a crime. A fantasy writer may begin with a world. A literary writer may begin with a character. None of these approaches is inherently right or wrong. Despite their differences, however, all successful stories eventually solve the same fundamental problems. They establish a protagonist, create movement, generate conflict, explore meaning, and arrive at a resolution. The path may vary, but the destination remains similar. The purpose of this document is to examine several major approaches to story development. Rather than presenting a single method as universally correct, we will explore how different starting points can lead to the creation of a complete narrative. To make these approaches easier to compare, we will use the same basic story concept throughout the document. By examining how different development methods build upon this simple idea, it becomes possible to understand both the strengths and limitations of each approach. One of the most common approaches to story development begins with a premise. A premise is a central situation, concept, or narrative possibility that immediately creates curiosity. It presents something interesting enough to make the writer ask questions. For example, a fisherman discovers a mysterious lantern after a storm. At this stage, very little is known. The premise does not explain who the fisherman is, what the lantern does, what the story means, or how the narrative ends. It simply presents an intriguing situation. The strength of premise first development is that it encourages exploration. A strong premise naturally generates questions. Why is the lantern mysterious? Where did it come from? What happens when the fisherman discovers it? Why does the discovery matter? These questions motivate further development. Many stories begin this way because an interesting premise often arrives suddenly. A writer imagines a situation and becomes curious about its implications. Development then becomes a process of answering the questions created by the premise. Consider the fisherman example. Initially, the writer knows only that a fisherman discovers a lantern after a storm. To transform this premise into a story, additional decisions must be made. Who is the fisherman? Perhaps he is young and ambitious. What does he want? Perhaps he dreams of becoming wealthy. What does the lantern do? Perhaps it appears to guide him toward hidden treasure. What conflict emerges? The lantern repeatedly leads him toward people in danger rather than riches. What does he learn? Helping others provides greater fulfillment than wealth. Gradually, the writer begins constructing a complete narrative around the original idea. The premise serves as the seed from which the story grows. Many well-known stories began in a similar manner. A writer imagined an unusual situation and then explored its consequences. The development process involved expanding that situation until characters, conflicts, themes, and resolutions emerged. The primary advantage of premise-first development is that it often produces stories with strong conceptual hooks. The central idea immediately attracts attention and creates curiosity. The primary challenge is that an interesting premise does not automatically produce a complete narrative. Many writers discover exciting concepts that generate questions, but fail to provide satisfying answers. The premise creates the opportunity for a story, but the writer must still develop characters, conflicts, and meaning. For this reason, premise-first development is often most successful when the writer remains willing to move beyond the original idea and discover what kind of story the premise actually wants to become. Another common approach begins not with a situation, but with a person. In character-first development, the writer starts by creating a protagonist, and then builds the story around that character's desires, fears, beliefs, and struggles. The central question becomes, who is this person, rather than what happens. Writers who favour this approach often find human behaviour more interesting than plot mechanics. They become fascinated by a character and then search for situations that reveal who that character truly is. Returning to the fisherman example, the process begins differently. Instead of starting with a lantern, the writer first develops a fisherman. Perhaps his name is Finnegan. He comes from a poor coastal village. He dreams of escaping poverty and becoming wealthy. He believes money will solve his problems. He admires successful merchants and envies their lifestyles. At this stage, there is no lantern. The writer's attention remains focused on the character. Once the protagonist feels real, the writer begins looking for opportunities to challenge that character. What kind of story would force Finnegan to confront his beliefs? What circumstances would test his priorities? What experiences might transform him? Only then does the lantern appear. A mysterious lantern washes ashore after a storm. Finnegan believes it may lead him toward treasure. Because the character already desires wealth, the lantern immediately becomes meaningful. The plot emerges naturally from the character's goals. As the story progresses, the lantern repeatedly leads Finnegan toward opportunities to help others rather than opportunities to become rich. Each encounter challenges his assumptions and forces him to reconsider what truly matters. Notice the difference. In premise-first development, the writer starts with the lantern and gradually discovers the fisherman. In character-first development, the writer starts with the fisherman and gradually discovers the lantern. Both methods can eventually produce very similar stories, but the development process feels different. The strength of character-first development is that it often produces emotionally engaging narratives. Because the story is built around a character's internal journey, conflicts tend to feel meaningful and personal. Characters developed in this way often possess clear motivations, recognizable flaws, and believable transformations. This approach is especially common in literary fiction, drama, and other character-driven stories. Compelling characters do not automatically create compelling plots. A writer may develop a fascinating protagonist, yet struggle to find events that meaningfully challenge that character. For this reason, character-first development eventually requires a second question. What situation will force this character to change? The answer often becomes a story itself. When successful, character and plot become inseparable. The story emerges from the interaction between a specific person and the obstacles placed in that person's path.